So welcome to this De Morgan Foundation lunchtime lecture on De Morgan's Menagerie, and it's my great honour and privilege today to welcome back Rob Higgins, who very kindly has given a talk on his De Morgan tiles before. Rob's an expert on De Morgan, and he's going to introduce himself with a quick preview of some of his books before taking us on a tour of some of De Morgan's animal-based tiles. Welcome back, Rob, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction. Yeah, William De Morgan is famous for his fantastic animals, so I thought it was worth looking at them in a bit more detail, and perhaps for a bit of a change, I've just lined him up against some of his contemporaries and followers, the people who came after him. And we'll whiz through literally hundreds of pictures of tiles, or pictures of hundreds of tiles, and I hope that'll be enjoyable. I've got a slightly flaky broadband connection here, and if I try and share screen, the signal drops out. So I'm going to have to keep on saying next slide, please, to Sarah. Next slide, please. I hope that doesn't give you flashbacks to lockdown news conferences. So the object of the presentation is to persuade you or introduce you to the idea that De Morgan was the premier British ceramicist for animal illustration, or you might decide he wasn't. He isn't in this household. He isn't regarded as the premier. So in the running order, there's a short introduction, British animal tile designs, De Morgan's animals, and then I think perhaps some insights from the De Morgan Foundation. So next, please. So starting with other tiles that are either British or available in Britain, before De Morgan, very few of them really featured animals. On the right, we can see some sort of Gothic, medieval and inspired designs. There's at least one there from Malvern, and Pugin's crows that featured in so many of his drawings, and particularly tiles. The animals seen in these types of tiles are normally, I would call, heraldic in their pose and their style, but still fairly naturalistic. The continent, or Europe, had a long history of tile making when it was still almost paused in Britain. So I've given you a couple of images from Spain, Seville. The one on the left is 16th, 17th century. The bird, perhaps slightly unusual for the Spanish tiles, and almost closer to what we'll see from other designers and De Morgan. On the right there is a moulded lion. Many of these tiles were made often about 3 inches by 3 inches square. The Dutch tile industry was enormously important, and I've given an example of a bird tile. It's actually a copy made in the 1870s by Frederick Garrard in Millwall in London, but exactly the same as many of the tiles made in the Netherlands for 200 years before tile making took off and De Morgan started in the UK. But arguably many of the best Dutch tiles were naturalistic landscapes or biblical scenes. The animals tended to be painted naively and sometimes very small in the centre of the tile. Minton's in Stoke Trent started making majolica pottery and some tiles in the 1860s, perhaps late 1850s as well, before De Morgan started, and these followed in an Italian-Spanish tradition. And some of these feature animals. So on the left, you've got a hippocamp, a seahorse, mythical seahorse, and on the right, a sort of griffin. certainly a winged lion. And if you just remember the hippocamp, you'll see a De Morgan hippocamp later, and indeed a De Morgan winged lion. Next, please. Here are some images from Cardiff Castle. Well, on top left might be Castle Cock up the hill, but the Marquis of Bute from 1868 onwards had got the architect and designer William Burgess to redecorate, rebuild in Cardiff. And some of this work comes after De Morgan started. It took him, well, I don't think he quite finished when he died 10 or 15 years later, William Burgess. But the range of animal illustration in the castle typifies as perhaps what was going on in the Victorian era before William Morris and William De Morgan. So there's a huge range of techniques and a huge range of styles. On the right, you can see moulded tiles in the Spanish medieval style, again made by Frederick Garrard in Millwall. Top centre, you've got encaustic tiles with repeating designs, perhaps not in a medieval tile manner, but certainly perhaps inspired by medieval manuscripts. Top left, there are a range of the birds at the bottom are a bit Puginesque, and there's part of a set of zodiac tiles. At bottom left, there's a whole series of these animals in very, very naturalistic style. They contrast entirely with what isn't a tile but is a wall painting, bottom centre, which is highly anthropomorphic, and, well, in my opinion, hideously so. But that was one strand of Victorian tile making. And as we move on, you can perhaps think of the animal designs as being influenced in three different ways. If you were going to portray an animal in ceramic art, it could either be very naturalistic, bottom left. It could be anthropomorphic, bottom centre. Sometimes that anthropomorphic, the animal perhaps appealing to you, having a personality that might be almost human, but probably it didn't have itself. That could be achieved through working on the way the eye is portrayed. Or an animal could be very stylized, perhaps a bit like some of the repeating images, top center. And it's what we're going to see pretty well. Every image is a mixture of being perhaps slightly anthropomorphic, perhaps naturalistic, and perhaps stylized, what we would call stylized. It was called conventional decoration in the day, which is a slightly confusing term, particularly when conventional thinking was called canonical. But anyway, if we move on to the next one, please. Here are some more ceramic tiles, contemporary with De Morgan, and perhaps we're starting to see some more influences from De Morgan and possibly some influences with him. So on the left at the top are two tiles. One on the right is certainly from the Minton's Art Pottery Studio, and top left is probably from the Minton's Art Pottery Studio. And this was established in the early 1870s by Minton's of Stoke Trent. But the idea was to produce art pottery, and it was based in Kensington in London. It only operated for a few years. William Coleman was the artist in charge, and you may be familiar with the large circular wall plaques or plates with female heads on. But they produced a huge range of art pottery, were very influential. this dates from around the time De Morgan was starting in work. And another similarity with De Morgan is it didn't really make any money. And when there was a fire in the works, I think in about 1875, Mintons were quite happy to close it down and move the manufacturing to Stoke-on-Trent. Top middle, perhaps you might think this is a bit anthropomorphic, the expression on particularly the little fish, which of course cormorant can't possibly swallow because it's facing the wrong way to go down its throat with the scales. Holland and Holt were a stained glass manufacturer in Warwick, and like many stained glass makers, painted a few tiles. Bottom centre is Minton's Stoke-on-Trent, perhaps from mid-1880s, and this is very Japanesque in the aesthetic style, with cranes in various poses and a bit of amusing killing in the background. On the right is Philip Webb, the architect who worked with William Morris. And this is as much as we'll see of William Morris, because certainly in his tiles, we don't really see much in the way of animals. The very Dutch-looking tile there is one of a series designed by Philip Webb, painted in the Netherlands and imported by William Morris and Co. Philip Webb, if you go to Whitwick Manor, you'll see some lovely drawings of animals, hares and birds on paper. Some of these were probably transferred onto tiles, and those are examples, bottom right, possibly by Philip Webb. Next slide, please. So if we move on to the later 19th century, at this time, William De Morgan, who started making tiles in 1872, was well established. We're looking at 1880s and 1890s through to the beginning of the 20th century here. The mass market in Stoke-on-Trent produced huge numbers of tiles, most of them floral or neo-Gothical designs, but a number of animals featured. And I've included a row of those at the top: Decorative Art Tile Company, Henry Abraham Ollivant, Charles Timmis in Stoke-on-Trent, and Craven Dunnell near Ironbridge in Shropshire. And you can see these are transfers printed, so capable of being produced in large numbers, and well, pretty naturalistic designs. The transfers are hand painted. You can see print and tint, they would be called. Bottom centre, another Stoke company, Wedgwood, produced quite a few very naturalistic farmyard scenes. William Wise was a well-known illustrator who did the drawings for these. Bottom left, another Ironbridge, Shropshire company, Moore. We're getting in perhaps to the early 20th century here, a moulded tile with a stylized peacock, perhaps in a manner of Indian artists. And on the right, the red tiles, at the top we've got CFA Voisey, the well-known designer who worked with fabrics and furniture and ceramics and metalwork in the late 19th, early 20th century. He designed a number of tiles for Pilkingtons in Manchester, and there's a slightly self-satisfied looking fish. We'll see that fish, or perhaps we've already seen as well, fish are difficult to draw for this type of art. Either they look too anthropomorphic or too naturalistic and uninteresting. Anyway, Voices sort of struck perhaps a halfway house there. The three tiles by Moore and Co. of Chatfield near Ironbridge in Shropshire were designed by Lewis Day, another prolific and talented designer, most of whose work post-dated De Morgan. And he produced this. There are two more in the series, I think. These beast lion designs, perhaps in well, they post-date De Morgan's animals, so perhaps they're Moore's version, and Lewis Day has perhaps gone to some lengths to differentiate them from William De Morgan. They're very heraldic. You can see the feet in particular are exaggerated in size to help the design fit the tile. Next, please. Okay, between the wars, and it's getting to the point where you can't always assume that means the First World War and the Second World War, but it does in this case. It wasn't a huge couple of decades for British tile design, to be honest. The mass market ceased to be interested in richly decorated tiles, and plain mottled subdued colours were by and large the order of the day. On the right, there's something from Honiton Pottery. They produced a series of rather naively painted tiles for nurseries. Bottom right, Packard and Ord, now Marlborough tiles, still in business, hand painted in quite a naturalistic manner. To give you something truly sort of Art Deco, we have to nip over the Atlantic to the American Encaustic Tile Company, and that rather charming hippopotamus is one of a very large series of animal designs, and human as well, incorporated into the walls of a primary school in Wisconsin. Carter and Co., bottom left, produced a number of animal designs in this period. That's one of a series of farmyard scenes by E. Strickland. And what I'm not showing you, apologies, is that Edward Borden, the well-known illustrator and designer, also produced a series of tiles for them, some of which just had animals. But I think that the star of the show in the interwar years is a one-off design by John Skeeping, who I think was the first husband of Barbara Hepworth. He, just as the war started, was involved in the production of this tile frieze, which was on the front of a primary school in Castleford, Yorkshire. And this is now preserved and is no longer a school, but it's a business centre. And perhaps inspired by Kay Lasco and other cave art designs. There's a huge frieze, only a small bit of which I've shown here, that runs all around the front of the building with this beautiful incised decoration. But this is unique and very much a one-off, so certainly in the context of Britain. So if we go next slide, please. A special section for the people who did produce the best animal tiles between the wars, Polly Brace and Kathleen Pillsbury, who met as students at the Central School of Art and set up tile decoration work in London. Some hand-painted designs, but many of them stenciled and then embellished by hand. And you can see the range of designs here. Many of them are on 4-inch tiles rather than 6-inch. And one thing, they were designed by Polly Brace, and she seems to have been particularly good at drawing animals from behind, so to speak. So rather than the subject staring at you, you're kind of left wondering what it's looking at, what might be going on. And that, well, if we go to the next slide, we'll see other examples of how she didn't rely on the subject looking at you. These farmyard scenes from perhaps around 1930. I find a bit different and perhaps slightly unsettling. It doesn't make you feel the animals are necessarily happy, but I suppose they're all, or certainly the four-legged ones are fresh born. So maybe she's just capturing that. Next slide, please. And some more scenes from Dunsmore, again showing the skill of the stencil work and the skill of the design. The kangaroo is looking away from you. Pigs, perhaps it's easier to draw from behind with a curly tail. But I don't think many people would have thought to draw the kangaroo in that manner. But to my mind, it works perfectly, and the earth colours are like the Australian outback. The four tiles on the right I've noted are from the ex-Peter Crefeld collection. I just mentioned that in case anyone recognises the name or knows of him, but he had one of the biggest private collections of De Morgan tiles. Within that were slipped a few choice others, which included these Dunsmore animals. Next slide, please. Well, after the Second World War, design changed markedly. Carter and Co. Has a section on the left, and they were the premier, if you like, art tile makers in the UK, certainly the mass market. On the top, this is Stratford, East London, and that's part of the Olympic Park you can just see behind. But there was a company, it's still there, the Dane Printing Works, and Carter produced this delightful panel. Bottom left is part of the Gordon Cullen, an architect, designed mural in the shopping arcade in Coventry. So the section you see there, those are 6-inch tiles, so it's 6 or 7 feet tall, with dinosaurs reflecting the coal mining and fossil finds made near Coventry. And other tiles, you can see the two mice, the little Bambi, were produced in quite large numbers. And one of their artists, called Phyllis Butler, hand painted a series of tiles with birds. More modernistic designs, which arguably it's more difficult to trace the roots back to De Morgan, were also popular. Dovecote Studios, top right, was based in Edinburgh, briefly Glasgow, and back in Edinburgh from the mid to late 1950s onwards, and was an offshoot of the Edinburgh Tapestry Company. The three tiles at the top were designed by Robert Stewart, based in Glasgow. He was an enormously talented designer and designed the fabrics for Liberties. At the time, Lucien Day designed the fabrics for Heels. And those birds are perhaps typical of the very modernistic style. One of his ex-students from Glasgow, called Margaret Stewart, no relation, also worked there and designed cats and birds, perhaps in a slightly more Scandinavian style. You can see examples there. And later, through the 1960s and 70s, the premier art tile makers in Britain were Anwyn Reeves and Kenneth Clark, based in London, and then Lewis near Brighton. Not many of her designs are animal based, but you can see a cat, a chicken, and some particularly skeletal and prehistoric looking fish. These were done with a matte black glaze that was stenciled or painted on and then embellished with the blobs of colour. Next slide, please. Again, I've picked out one person for special mention from this period. You can see his dates, 1962 to 1983. He was active making tiles. And this is Kenneth Townsend, who worked in Lewes on the south coast and had a series of 20 probably 28 different animal designs that were sold widely, including through the design centre in London. Initially, these were sprayed, stenciled and hand embellished, particularly like the top row. And coming back to earlier to what I said about the eyes, you can see he's in some cases exaggerated the size of the eyes, and they give a bit of expression. I love the rather mean looking squirrel, which didn't make the main series. I think he just made a couple of those in the early 1960s. But the lion extreme right was quite a popular design, although he reduced the size of the eyes later on so it didn't look so mournful. Next slide, please. And here are some more from the series and just some examples of the skill involved in designing your series of screens to build up the colour screen printing. So his later tiles required virtually no hand embellishment, making them perhaps a bit quicker and easier to make. Next slide, please. Later 20th century and studio, there are a variety of designers I've shown here. Jeff Beeston worked in Oxfordshire, South Warwickshire, Shipston on Stour, and again stenciled. Perhaps those aren't to everybody's taste. Fiona Cutting, with her husband John, worked in Norfolk and produced a good range of animal tiles, but they're all pretty naturalistic, and the buff brown colours of the background and the tones perhaps aren't to everybody's taste now. Clive Simmons, bottom left, made a few animal tiles using his wax resist technique. The owls were popular. And a special mention for John Riley on the Isle of Wight, studio potter, who made some tiles. And his owls, I think, are absolutely fantastic. I love that expression as it's leaping down. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. We're encroaching on the 21st century here. And again, it's about studio potters on the left. Iris Millward in particular painted absolutely beautifully and produced a series of tiles with a little bit of text that she called poetry tiles. That's what's incised on the back. These weren't produced in large numbers. And again, a sort of bit of a one-off is Alistair Gray, Queer Fishes. This is a great big slab of a tile, and one of a series that he designed for a mural which is at Hillhead, I think, station on the Glasgow Underground Railway system. And there were holes. He was a well-known illustrator. He's produced many illustrated books, and the theme of the mural was the variety of people who lived in Glasgow. That's a slight second, which didn't get onto the underground. He's next to me here. So that's the end of a dash through the British tile makers. And if we go, I think next slide, please. The summary, I would say animal studies have always been pretty popular on ceramic tiles, especially hunting, historically anyway. Domestic animals, farmyard animals, but most animal designs were sporadic, and a few people produced large series. Polly Brace and Kathleen Pillsbury, as we've seen, Kenneth Townsend. How do they compare to Morgan? Well, let's go to the next one, please. That's the running order. Next, please. So left is the image of De Morgan as a long head drop out from art school. As a younger child, he was documented by his mother as being fascinated with Bewick's Book of Birds, and there's a kingfisher from Bewick Book of Birds, but perhaps what is notable, apart from the kingfisher and perhaps a barn owl, is that he didn't copy from Bewick's Book of Birds. He may have adapted and changed things. When he started making tiles, De Morgan lived close to Dante Gabriel Rossetti. There's a cartoon top centre, and Rossetti kept quite a famous menagerie of animals, which are shown there together with a variety of people. You can see William Morris declaiming his poetry, which is putting everybody to sleep. But it's not clear. By the mid-1870s, I'm not sure De Morgan moved in the same circles as Rossetti particularly, and there don't seem to be a whole load of direct connections, although Sarah can connect me there. In the 1860s, De Morgan worked with stained glass, as we've heard and seen through the Foundation's talks. And if you sift through the images, you'll find a few portrayals of animals, and these are details of windows at the parish church in Rochester, Staffordshire. But they're, with the possible exception of the dragon being slain by St. Michael, I think, they don't relate closely to his animal work. Next slide, please. So De Morgan's animal tiles, I think it depends a bit how you count them, but we've got about 220 known designs, and that's a single tile with the animal being the dominant part of the image. The majority of these were designed early in his Chelsea period, and I've listed 87 birds, 82 mammals, 27 mythical or imaginary beasts, and a few fish and snakes and so on. And I just put that listing because De Morgan's famous for his mythical imaginary animals, but they're actually only a small part of his series. Next, please. So we'll take you through at some speed a whole lot of De Morgan's animals, and you can, in your mind, compare them with what we've seen from other people, and how you feel about the extent to which they're stylized, naturalistic, or sometimes anthropomorphic. Top left is the owl with the mouse, a well-known design, made some with a blue background in the later Fulham period. Bottom right is the winking owl, which wasn't so popular, but is again quite amusing, but is about as overtly anthropomorphic as William de Morgan gets. Next slide, please. Here are some more birds. Top left, the hoopoe. Often you see his some of his animals. There's a little imaginary snark or beastie in the top corner. There's the kingfisher, top right, from the Bewick Book of Birds pose, although kingfishers only pose in a limited number of ways anyway. It's got an elongated beak, and well, who's won? It looks like mutually assured destruction there, and some different treatments of the dodo. Next slide, please. Some more birds, sorry. Top right, there's a stylized peacock. At bottom left, a more naturalistic peacock. But the other birds there are based quite closely on real birds, and that's a theme we'll come back to a bit later. Bottom right is a curassow, perhaps, I think. Whether De Morgan, well, he had access to books, of course. He could have gone to the zoological gardens at Regent's Park and seen some of the more exotic ones. But he's tweaked them, but many of these are quite true to life. Next, please. And here we have another group, and going back to the theme of being true to life, if you like. Those would do very nicely for two dunlins, small waders, top left. In the centre, the bird with the enormous eyebrows is a Slavonian grebe. That is not a common type of grebe, but very close to what they actually look like. And the stork and the frog, centre right, again, one of De Morgan's masterpieces. And again, it begs a question about what's going on in their minds. One of them perhaps thinking my new best friend, and the other one thinking lunch. Next, please. Some other medium-sized birds. The cockatoo top left is getting away from perhaps his purely animal portraits and is showing one of the rules of ornamentation, that as you make the subject smaller, it should perhaps be more stylized, particularly as it's going to repeat. Next slide, please. So we're on to from birds to the cloven hoof mammals. There's a gnu, top left of centre, with a little beast next to it. And in my mind, that must be an identifiable small mammal from Africa, but I'm not sure what. Top left, you might think was part of a zodiac series, that being Capricorn, but we don't have obviously a series, so it may just be jumping over the moon. And antelopes, you can see De Morgan was particularly fond of drawing. Next slide, please. The hares in the centre, it's an ex-Peter Creffield tile, porcupine, bottom centre, marmot, sort of large rat that lives in holes in mountains in Central Europe, bottom left. And you can see top left and bottom right that his firings weren't always successful, particularly with the luster, which was technically very difficult to work with. So little desert rats, the luster didn't fire fully, and the wolf on the right has come out too heavily. But De Morgan was working at the cutting edge of his technology. Next, please. Big cats feature in several different designs, and the lioness centre and the lion and cub bottom centre, to my mind, are two of my favourite designs of his. Next, please. I'll keep rattling off. Fish and others. On the left panel, we've got some chameleons. Bottom left, it's often referred to as a turtle, but I'm sure it is a Galapagos tortoise, of which there were some, or at least samples of, in London at the time, and would fit in with the interest that De Morgan had, not only in nature, but also the science of the day. And of course, they were an important part of the development of the theory of evolution. Top right, courtesy of De Morgan Foundation, the fish with the little fish. First sight, you would think the big fish is about to eat the little fish, but I'm sure that it is one of the types of grouper or other fish that look after their babies by keeping them in their mouths. So another De Morgan observation that isn't perhaps what it seems at first sight, but entirely true to life, and works on several levels. Fantastic tile. Next, please. If we come to the fantastic creatures, so we have not a huge part, perhaps enormously well known, but not a huge part of his work. I won't dwell on these too long. You can see there's hippocamp, very different from the Minton's one we saw earlier on. Top left is an aurorabus, I think you say it, an animal which is eating its own tail, and is a sort of mythological depiction of infinity, if you like. Top right, two early designed winged lions or griffins. The one in the top corner has got a little one with it. We're not clear whether that's something it's about to kill or whether that's a baby it's looking after. The one next to it I like, because normally beasts like that in heraldry are holding a sword, a weapon of destruction. And as far as I can see, that one's depicted showing a fish bone or something. Perhaps I can be corrected on that. But De Morgan's non-violent tendencies showing in the way he's tweaked that design. And bottom right, we have his fantastic ducks that were printed on silk scarves by Liberties for so long, stenciled designs. But again, showing as you shrink the size of the subject, to be pleasing in pattern making, it should perhaps become more and more stylized. Next slide, please. Panels and larger tiles I'll race through and not dwell on, because I'm going on longer than I thought I would. But mostly the animals are subsumed into more complex designs. So here's quite a large panel with snakes and parrots, but they're just part of the overall design with palmettes and curved leaves. Next, please. And again, we see the two-tile panel. The snake is that big 8-inch tiles continues to be a major part of the design. The barn owls there falling asleep or falling over was a popular design, although we don't see many of the tiles now. There again, 8-inch tiles. The parrot's very much in a Persian style. Next slide, please. You see a number of tall, thin, or repeating designs that sometimes produced sort of long, lanky animals, really not terribly realistic in their own right, but drawn to fit the space available, like the winged lion on the right. On the left is a repeating design that gave me real trouble. It's in the book of the V&A designs, pictured horizontally, but if you look at the eagle, it has to be that way up. But what are the cormorants doing? And this was a mystery to me for a long time, until last year when I went to Bird Reserve in France, where the cormorants nest in trees. And cormorants are brilliant underwater. They're strong flyers. Put them in a colony on a tree, and they're always falling off. If you have a big colony, there's always one falling over. And suddenly, after years of looking at this design and thinking, what's it about? Suddenly it comes to life. It's about careful observation. There must have been colonies of cormorants on islands along the Thames. Next slide, please. This is another panel, probably painted by De Morgan himself, but I'll skip over that. Next slide, please. And here's another design which I've put at the end. There's the design painted on paper, and the actual tiles. Some of the colours have been changed slightly in the actual panel, but you're getting close to a sort of Art Nouveau, and it's very stylised for De Morgan, with the leaves on the bodies of the birds. Next, please. And I've shown you individual tiles, but this is the way many of them appeared in situ. So the big picture on the left is from a catalogue by Altum Heaton, who were a big upmarket home interior decorators in London. They did the decoration for the Titanic, although De Morgan was out of business then, so the tiles were Pilkington's. Top right is the fireplace in Lewis Carroll's rooms at Christ Church, Oxford. Perhaps the De Morgan's tiles didn't inspire the hunting of the snark, but you can see the eagle top right there with a little snark next to it. So I'm sure there was a connection there. And bottom right is a fireplace in what is now an old people's home in Wolverhampton. Was once a posh house. My advice also is, if you get a lot of De Morgan tiles, don't put them on the bottom like that as part of the hearth, because they've all been smashed by coal buckets. Next, please. So De Morgan versus the rest, if you want to see it as a versus, difference in subject matter, treatment techniques. Notable mentions for Polly Brace and Kathleen Pillsbury and Kenneth Townsend. Is De Morgan the best? Well, it's just a matter of opinion, isn't it, in some ways? But next slide. But you could buy a perfectly good Dunsmore or Kenneth Townsend tile for less than 1% of the value of a De Morgan chameleon tile, which I suppose it depends whether you're buying or selling, doesn't it, perhaps? Last slide, please. So thank you. And there's the De Morgan Beast Bogey with its rainbow lustre photographed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. Absolutely brilliant talk as ever, with so many wonderful illustrations, and your story there about the cormorant and kind of looking to nature to try and solve some of those puzzles that have been playing on your mind about De Morgan's designs in the past was really wonderful. I really enjoyed that. So thank you so much. I don't know if anybody has any questions for Rob. Do you want to keep those coming in the chat box if you do, and I can put them to him? I have one from Margaret, Rob. Bear with me, it's a long one, so I'll read this out to you. She said, De Morgan, of course, was associated with the arts and crafts movement and had, therefore, an explicitly political intention in making his tiles, involving accessibility of beauty to the working classes, as well as manufacturing decorative work under circumstances that were non-exploitive. How many of these later artists' work that were influenced by De Morgan's do you think might have been influenced by this political and ethical practice as well?
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think De Morgan was well aware that the working classes couldn't afford his tiles. He sold his painted tiles for 2 shillings and 6pence each, which is the equivalent of £16, 15, £16 in today's money, which is probably $20 each. But
about a week's wages in the late 19th century, that wasn't it, Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you could get a Staffordshire print and tint tile of the type I showed you for 3pence to 6pence. 20% of that costs. The main point of the question is is influence. I've shown you some artistic influence, perhaps, or you can draw your own conclusions about artistic influence. In terms of De Morgan's politics, I'm not. He wasn't overtly socialist in the way William Morris and Walter Crane were So I don't think he influenced that line of thought. And in any case, by the end of the 19th century, and the arts and crafts movement had moved, perhaps with companies like Pilkington's being involved, to harnessing machines in a humane way rather than replacing them. De Morgan's ethical practices in terms of how he employed his workforce, I think did continue as a thread, perhaps not so much in tile makers, but certainly through art pottery with people like William Howson Taylor at Ruskin Pottery. And then, of course, it morphed into, if you like, studio pottery with most of the people being, if you like, self-employed and making the stuff themselves, rather than the perhaps very Victorian model of De Morgan and William Howson Taylor, I suppose, where the boss employed people to make the stuff. So I think that there's certainly a thread there, but you have to look for it in some ways. Does that help?
It's certainly helped me. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a lovely answer to the question, Rob, and to be able to, you know, look not just visually at De Morgan's tiles, but perhaps some of his practices and see how they influenced future generations. That's great. I have another question from Jerry, which is about encaustic tiles and the making process of them, and whether there are any benefits within that process.
The tiles that De Morgan made are a flat piece of clay that was fired as biscuit and then painted and glazed, decorated, sometimes moulded. An encaustic tile is where the pattern isn't painted onto the tile, but is formed by layers of clay, so that the pattern you see is clay and not paint, if you like, and maybe several millimeters thick. That means you've got a design which can be very hard wearing. So if you put it on the floor, even if lots of people walk on it and it wears down, the pattern will still be there. It is, however, very difficult to produce shaded designs, and it takes a lot of there are some Minton's encaustic tiles with 7 or 8 different colours, but it was time consuming to put them in and technically quite demanding, because if the shrinkage of one colour clay was different from the others, the whole tile could be scrap. So at the time De Morgan was making tiles, the tiles you would have put on the floor or possibly on your hearth were mostly encaustic. But De Morgan and Morris didn't make those. They made tiles to attach to vertical surfaces.
Sorry, I keep losing my taskbar with my mute button. So I keep muting myself so I'm not interrupting you, Rob, and then I can't get back on. Yeah, lovely. Thank you for that. It's a very clear explanation of how that works. So another comment, I think, from Martin, who I'm sure won't mind my telling everyone is Emeritus Fellow in Organic Chemistry at Christ Church College in Oxford. He sort of tells the tale that supposedly Alice of Alice in Wonderland fame describes Dodgson, so Lewis Carroll, telling her stories about those various animals and characters in the De Morgan fireplace, and told her once that the kingfisher spearing the fish is how he liked to greet visitors he didn't like, which is a lovely anecdote to have. And we can see the kingfisher just behind your head as well there, Rob.
Oh right, yes.
And actually, I'll get rid of screenshots. I think
move across to the side. Yeah, well, thanks very much for that information. I don't think Dodgson was inspired enormously De Morgan's designs, and it didn't work the other way, because I think a lot of Dodgson's work and the Hunting and the Snark predated De Morgan. if I'm correct, but they arrived at a similar place through different routes, and I think they're the way that they used words and images are very complementary.
And another comment from Martin, which I'm not sure I did know, is that the Christchurch tiles, they're missing the tile at the top left-hand corner. And are there any copies of it? Now, Martin, do you mean, could you purchase a reproduction tile to fill the gap? He does. You have to look at the slide from the top left corner, which I've unhelpfully stopped.
Oh, that one.
Sharing.
Yeah, it's well, these days you can the modern idiom in tile design is you come up with the design and we'll make you a copy of it. So if you had that tile, to have a copy made that was red but not red luster would be very easy. To have one made with a good reduction luster glaze would be more difficult, but there are a couple of studio potters around who could certainly do that. I would love to say that I had one and you could make a copy of it. I've got that design, but with a green with a dark green background rather than the sprigged background.
Yeah, I'll double check the De Morgan collection for you, Martin, because I think we do have that design, and as far as I'm aware, it's called Ornamental Bird. So I'll have a look at that for you, and yeah, I mean, you can always keep your eyes on the sales and the art market and see what that's doing as well, but that will cost you a lot more probably than a reproduction, even a studio pottery one.
If you wanted a reproduction that wouldn't stand up to hugely close examination, all you need is a decent quality image and £20 or £30.
Yeah.
I say if you wanted one made in reduction luster that would be very close, the people like Kenneth Clark and Marguerite Clinton, who made high quality reproductions, are now, well, they're dead. The people currently working in reduction luster aren't using necessarily the same style, so it might be quite time consuming for them to make a De Morgan reproduction.
And Jane has sent a comment there, Martin. I hope you can see that Jane's got a beautiful reproduction fireplace from Pilgrim Tiles, so do look them up as well. Thank you very much, everybody. Well, we've been here for an hour chatting about tiles, which has been just wonderful, but I think we'll let everybody get off and enjoy lunchtime as well. Lots of lovely comments coming through in the chat box, Rob, to say thank you so much for your talk today and how wonderful all the pictures were, and what a lovely run through it was of not just De Morgan, but what came before, kind of simultaneously, and how he inspired future generations as well. So that's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much from me, and thank you everybody for listening. Yep. And we'll see you all again in 2 weeks' time, I hope, for a run through of Evelyn De Morgan's costume and dress in her paintings. So do come back and join us then on the 9th of December. Thanks again, Rob. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.